Okay, hello everybody. Good evening to our on-site audience and to our virtual audience, and also to the audience that listens later to the presentation. We welcome Harald Bauder to our August joint lecture, evening lecture of the Institute for Migration Studies and Intercultural Relations and the SFB, Production of Migration. SFB means Collaborative Research Cluster, and that started in April this year with 15 research projects on the production of migration in different research clusters on figures of migration, infrastructure, and spaces of migration. And Harald's lecture tonight relates very nicely to a couple of these clusters and research projects. Harald is a professor in geography, and in the graduate program for immigration and settlement studies at Toronto Metropolitan University, and we are very happy to welcome you tonight. Currently, he's a fellow at the DECIM, so the Institute for Integration and Migration Studies, and he spends his summer in Berlin and came to us to discuss tonight sovereignty and solidarity, the production of migration in national and urban politics. And before I hand over to Harald, I would briefly like to present his research focus and to give an idea about his publications. So currently, he works in a huge project funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada, which is called it's a partnership grant, like a global partnership grant on urban sanctuary, migrant solidarity, and hospitality in global perspective. And we are very happy as IMIS to also collaborate with Harald in that joint project. So very recently, he published a book, From Sovereignty to Solidarity, with Routledge. And before, he had been very active also in discussing and presenting ideas on borders. He published, for example, the book on migration, borders, and freedom. And further, he is his approach is combines different theoretical and social, different approaches from social theory, and one is also to think in dialectics, and one of his books is also entitled Immigration Dialectics, Imagining Community, Economy, and Nation. And yeah, we are very much looking forward to Harald's presentation and also to our joint discussion afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I don't need this. This is on, right?
No, but for the online. No, this is okay, sorry.
I'll give you that then. All right, thank you very much. And I think it's great to be here in Osnabrück for several reasons. Not only it's a wonderful town, and I like everyone here, but also I'm really excited about the new project that you have going on, and what is it called? The SFB, right? On the production of migration, because this is something that relates to the topic that I'm going to talk about today. And then I'm also excited to be in Osnabrück because I'm going to challenge the idea of I want to challenge the idea of the Westphalian state. So it relates to what has happened here, 350 years ago in City Hall. So this is a perfect place for this kind of presentation to talk about sovereignty, but then also about solidarity. So starting with the production of migration. When we think of migrants, a migrant is usually somebody who crosses a state border. If I move from here, if I'm a resident of Osnabrück and I move to Munich, nobody would talk about myself as a migrant. But if somebody moves from, what's the closest city on the other side of Enschede to Osnabrück, then the person is already a migrant. And if you're from outside of Europe, of the European borders, and come here, then you're really a migrant, right? So already you see here that the migrant is a political construction. And today I want to challenge the Westphalian scale of the production of migration and connect that scale with the idea of sovereignty. And then I want to present a counter perspective that relates to the idea of solidarity. Solidarity and then also cities. That's when the urban politics come in. I'm drawing here on a book that Helen just mentioned, From Sovereignty to Solidarity. So if you're really interested in what I have to say, there's a more detailed treatment for it. The book and my presentation, what I'm trying to do is present an optimistic outlook. First, a critique of national sovereignty. I call it Westphalian sovereignty because of what happened here in City Council and the signing of the Westphalian Peace. And I ask, how did we end up with a territorial nation state that is able to claim sovereignty to prevent some people from crossing the border and enabling some people to cross, other people to cross? And this is not a natural situation. I think we take this in political debate and popular discourse. We take this for granted, but I think we need to challenge this idea and see it as a political and a historical process. And then I offer a solution, if you want, or a counter perspective, and think that if we don't think in terms of sovereignty, but in terms of solidarity, we can think in terms of in very different ways in which migration might be governed, maybe organized. And then I want to use the example of the Solidarity City, which is a research topic that I'm dealing with right now, and Helen also mentioned the project that I'm engaged in at the moment. So I have an overarching kind of thesis that power has always controlled human mobility, and I've seen when I go to conferences and in the literature, I always see, sometimes people mention, well, the original natural condition is that we all moved around freely across the border, across the surface of the earth, and then somebody put these borders there. But I don't think that's quite true. I think that in a human society, power has always controlled mobility. In ancient empires, we have also always seen that people in power control the mobility that are not in power. The medieval feudal system in Europe, the feudal system, but in other parts of the world, we see this exercising of power through the constraint of mobility. In colonialism or slavery, here we have an image of one of the gates of no return on the coast of Ghana, through which enslaved Africans were forcefully brought to the Americas. Another example of, in this case, enabling migration. Rendering some people immobile and others highly mobile is a way of exercising authority and power and producing and maintaining inequality. And I don't think that this principle hasn't changed much. It's just that today it's the territorial nation state that exercises this principle by claiming sovereignty, state sovereignty. And that brings me to the idea of sovereignty. This is the wrong slide. I want to go back. Here. Sovereignty is an idea or a concept that emerged in Europe during the Enlightenment period. So it's in a way, it's inherently Eurocentric. And I think we should be aware of that and critically reflect on it. And it's not to be confused with indigenous sovereignty. There's a lot of debate right now about indigenous sovereignty, especially in countries like Canada, but it's not the same. Indigenous sovereignty acknowledges the interdependencies between actors, human actors, non-actors, and the land and so forth, whereas the Eurocentric kind of Westphalian sovereignty is something that is very state-centric. It follows a Cartesian kind of logic, which is shown here in this image, where the surface of the Earth is subdivided into mutually exclusive territorial states. And then these lines here define particular borders. We had a discussion earlier about what a border is. This is one kind of incarnation of this border, but it appears in different ways. And then people can move across these borders, or some people are not allowed to cross them. And the mechanism that enforces that is state sovereignty. And I want to, you know this image, right? I was there earlier before I came here. This is where the Westphalian treaties were signed, just down the road, 5 minutes from here. And at one point, a few years ago, I wanted to understand how this Westphalian idea of sovereignty in the territorial nation state, how it relates to migration. So I thought, okay, I'm going to look at the treaties, and what do the treaties say about migration? And what I found is very interesting. The treaties, I'm not claiming, by the way, that the treaties were really the very founding document. It was just a milestone. The transition from the feudal state to the modern state was a much more complex and a long process, but it was still an interesting snapshot in time. And what the treaties did, when we look at the text, it granted permission to immigrate to people with different religious denominations than the sovereign. So if your sovereign was Catholic, you were Lutheran, then you were able to, then the treaties regulated that you could leave the place or the territory. It protected the property of immigrants. It regulated the return of refugees of war. It granted safe passage to persons for the purpose of trade. And it restricted exit fees. So you were charged money to leave. And the treaties restricted that. So the treaties explicitly enabled migration and specified how migration should occur. And that is because at the time, the immobility was the norm. The norm was that the sovereign could control the migration of the subjects. So coming back to my initial thesis that power controls migration. And that was so in the treaties and in this transition from feudal to modern society as well. And today, of course, we have the modern territorial nation state that continues to control migration, but the focus is not so much on exit. The feudal state had a great interest in preventing the exit of people and of skills and of labor. Now we have control of entry, but still the control of mobility across borders is still the same kind of principle. Another kind of interesting aspect of sovereignty is that the conventional thinking right now, I think the popular thinking, but also the conventional thinking in a lot of the literature that I'm reading is that the nation state, by claiming sovereignty, can control human mobility across its borders, right? That's what we normally hear. But I want to also reverse this logic of thinking and suggest that controlling migration enables the Westphalian state to enact itself as sovereign to begin with. Okay, so it's not the sovereign state that controls migration, but in order to become sovereign, I'm going to control migration. And an example here is the United States of America. In the Declaration of Independence of 1776, it was already explicitly mentioned that the King of Great Britain refuses to increase immigration, and that would be one of the reasons why the territory seeks independence. That they wanted to grow population, but the King of England says, well, we are going to control migration. But the colony said, no, we want to have control over migration because that's our future. That's why we need to be independent. So the US needed migration to become a sovereign settler colonial state to begin with. And later on, and that's when it becomes really interesting, of course with independence there was a constitution was established and written and signed and so forth. And then immigration policy began to contradict the very principles of the Constitution, such as equality, human equality, and human liberty. So the principle suggests that people should be treated equally, but if you're born outside of the territory of the United States, you're not equal. So the equality principle is not applying. And liberty the same way. An example would be the Page Act of 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that was clearly based on exclusion based on race and origin. And more recently, we've heard about, in the Trump administration, the Muslim ban, so an exclusion based on religion, separating children from their parents, and all kinds of things that, for Americans, based on the Constitution, would not be possible. There's a so-called legal scholars talk about the plenary power doctrine that permits migration policy to contradict the very values of the Constitution and actually violate these values. And this plenary power doctrine says that migration policy is shielded from that. So in another way of thinking of this is that the state can say, when it comes to migration policy, I don't have to observe the moral principles or legal principles of the institution or human rights, international standards, for example. I can act independently as a sovereign. And this is the way that the state enacts itself as a sovereign, through migration policy, where I can say, it doesn't matter what the principles are, it doesn't matter, I'm an independent actor. I don't have to follow all these other principles and the Constitution. So again, in other words, migration policy enables the state to enact its own sovereignty. Sovereignty, I see it as a legal construct that needs to be enacted, or otherwise it would not exist. And migration policy serves that purpose. Okay, so what I've tried to show so far is that today, as in feudal times and before then, the control of human mobility is a tool to rule over territory and people. And today, the idea of sovereignty legitimates this control. And then I want to also, when we saw the outline, I want to present a counter perspective of that. How can we think differently of migration? And one of the interesting concepts and ideas, a non-state-centric way of framing migration could be in terms of solidarity. And that gets us into very different kind of territory. Interestingly, I don't think that it's so far-fetched to juxtapose solidarity with sovereignty. There are lots of examples where the state represses and criminalizes solidarity. And we see this in Europe, for example, actions against sea rescue, church asylum, humanitarian assistance at borders, for example. In the US, it has become criminal, or an offense to offer drinking water to people to cross the border in the desert. So apparently the solidarity with migrants challenges the Westphalian state and challenges the very sovereignty of the United States. I've looked at the idea of solidarity, how it's applied in the literature. Like sovereignty, solidarity is also a concept that is very Eurocentric and was developed emerged in Europe first. But unlike sovereignty, the concept of solidarity acknowledges that no person or state can act entirely independent from each other. So in this way, it's very, very different from sovereignty, which suggests exactly that. And with a graduate student, Laurel Joffs is her name, I did a scoping analysis of the literature, migration literature, and we wanted to know how is it applied and what are the philosophical origins of the way that solidarity is applied. And we found these different categories, a typology we developed. So there are non-Enlightenment traditions such as loyalty, or there's an indigenous kind of literature on solidarity. And there are various Enlightenment traditions relating to various white European male philosophers, including here on this picture, these boxes there, a self-centered kind of solidarity that can be traced back to Hobbes. And I'm not going to get into these different categories. There's a kind of solidarity going back to Hume and Kant, and then a recognitive solidarity that has been traced back to Hegel. This is not I borrowed that from the literature. I didn't develop this graphic. And my focus here is on this last category of solidarity that I find the most interesting one. It suggests that solidarity is a transformative social practice. and that solidarity can create new political subjectivities, whereas some of the others might relate to solidarity based on sympathy and compassion. That's a kind of different kind of solidarity as this reflective solidarity. And just to give you an example that we're on the same page here, I think a well-known example that a lot of you can relate to is the historical example of the labor movement. I'm showing an image here of a factory in the 19th century. Karl Marx has theorized this kind of working class solidarity, where the working class exists as a social fact in itself, but this working class needs to acquire a collective identity to become a political force. And solidarity provides a political process to achieve this goal, this aim. Also, this kind of reflective solidarity is implicated in anti-colonial struggles. And a good example here would be David Featherstone. He wrote a book on solidarity, and one of the examples that he presented in the book was the example of the cotton blockade in the 19th century, where factory workers in Manchester, where cotton was processed, were acted in solidarity with enslaved people in the American South, where cotton was produced. So a very different economic context. One was a slave economy, slave-based, enslaved people-based economy. The other one, an emerging factory kind of system. Geographically, they were on other sides of the world, if you want to say, if you want to call it that. But nevertheless, there was a solidarity emerging between these struggles, because they were also connected with each other. And today we're confronting other challenges. In a Westphalian system of territorial states, territorial states control mobility, human mobility, but people also resist this control. And human mobility forges solidarity among migrants and refugees, but also with them. People who are not migrating, who are not refugees, can also stand in solidarity with migrants and refugees. And when people migrate and flee from war, disaster, poverty, and so forth, they connect different places and they connect different contexts, not too dissimilar from the factory workers in Manchester and the enslaved people in the American South. So I see some interesting parallels here. An interesting example, this is also very, very prominent in the literature, and I'm sure you have heard about this. In Athens, there was between 2016 and 2019, there was a hotel. They called themselves the best hotel in Europe. And they had a large web-based campaign, online campaign, for asking for donations and so forth. It was actually an abandoned hotel at one point, and then it became a squatter settlement, or a squatter, and migrants and refugees built their own kind of community in this hotel. And the slogan was, the best hotel in Europe. We don't have a pool, no minibar, no room service. Instead, they self-organized a kindergarten, a pharmacy, something that was actually very useful to the community who lived there. And they formed a community, a library, a shared canteen, medical services, legal aid, language classes, hotel security, and so forth. And while it existed, City Plaza was a site of social and political transformation, so this kind of recognitive solidarity that transforms the social relations in its own kind of microscale. And creates new subjectivities of a new kind of community that did not necessarily exist before. And so this is sort of the microcosm of a single building where this is happening. But it's also, I see it in my own research in cities. Cities, like a building, you have to imagine a building, is a very different location as a nation state. There was a book written on, you might have heard about Benedict Anderson, wrote a book, Imagine Communities, and suggested that a nation state is not really it's really a very untangible kind of community because people actually don't know each other. So we need other kinds of frames of reference. So language would be one thing, or anthems and shared mythology, shared history. So these are all politically constructed and frankly, not only politically, but it become also very emotional. When you hear the national anthem and see the national flag, many of us have very strong emotions to that. So it's actually quite real. But there are also imagined communities because we don't know each other. Whereas a building like this, like City Plaza, this is a tangible community where people see each other in the hallways, they share a canteen, they share this place. So they have personal interaction with each other. And you can argue that a city, some cities are large, but you still have the sense of a tangible, real, physical community because you do sit with other people on the bus. You do sit, you have your children go to the same school. You play together, you're politically active together, you interact as neighbors in the workplace and so forth. So I suggest that cities can also present to a degree a counter-model to this Westphalian sovereign state in dealing with human mobility. I think the city, when we look at the city, it can help us rethink migration, reimagine inclusion and who belongs, that it might not be national citizenship, but it might be other criteria. Do you live in my city? Do you contribute to, do you volunteer with me in the food bank? Yeah? These are different kind of criteria of belonging. It can reframe community in membership. That's different from the national community. When we looked at, we did some research. I started doing research about 15 years ago on this topic, and the first thing that I did is I wanted to understand these characteristics, what makes up the, in this case it was a sanctuary city, which was a term that was very prominent in the US and Canada. At that time, Toronto just declared itself as a sanctuary city, modeled after other US cities, and I became interested in what does it actually entail. And I did some empirical research, and I found that there are different kind of dimensions of what this idea of the sanctuary city actually entails. There's a legal kind of dimension where a city's and municipality's legislative body, usually city council, affirmed being and supported the idea of supporting migrants and refugees, and affirmed being a sanctuary city to begin with. There's a discursive dimension, but also often entailed rescripting who belongs and rescripting migration, refugee narratives and discourses to something positive, whereas the national discourse was very negative, that refugees steal our jobs, migrants have high crime rates and so forth. Whereas on the urban scale, you see often, refugees are our neighbors, we work together, they make a contribution. There's an identity kind of dimension where we imagine the city as a space of belonging, quite independently from your national status. It doesn't matter what kind of citizenship you have. It doesn't really matter whether you don't have papers to be in the country. If you live within our boundaries, you're part of our community. So it's a very different approach towards community. And then a scalar aspect that municipalities and local civil society mobilizes a local infrastructure in terms of drop-in centers for undocumented migrants, such as we see here in the city of Palermo a few years ago. Also local administrations make their services, their municipal services available independent of national status, and a whole range of different initiatives, including in the US, for example, where city councils instructs local police forces not to collaborate with national police forces and immigration enforcement authorities. There are some other characteristics of these solidarity cities. It's interesting, I should also tell you that the term sanctuary city is very particular to the United States and Canada, and other terminology is used in other parts of the world. So I think in Europe, the idea, the concept, the term Solidarity city is often used, also city of refuge when we think of Barcelona. So there are different labels that float out there, but I think there's also some interesting commonalities. One of them is that top-down and bottom-up approaches often converge in the context of these solidarity cities. When I interviewed an activist in Berlin, he actually referred to a ping-pong game between grassroots activists and the municipal administration that kind of negotiate where they stand with this solidarity city and helping migrants and refugees to live their life and be included. There's also one of the characteristics is the domicile principle, that you belong not based on your birthright, whether you're born to a person that is a citizen or born on a territory, but if you live in a place, then you should also be included and have sort of rights in this place. And then also, solidarity cities do not necessarily reproduce a Cartesian, the container kind of logic of the sovereign territorial state. The lines, the map with the lines, you remember? And that came out also in my empirical research. For example, I also did interviews in Freiburg, in the southwest of Germany. And their logo for the campaign was this circle here with the Solidarity City Freiburg. That's modeled based on other similar kind of logos that existed in Toronto, for example, and other places in other parts of the world. But the activist that I talked to was very critical of this kind of perspective. And she said, I translated this from German to English. So this is the English version. I find it a bit scary. There are sanctuary cities and the hostile surrounding area, which is symbolized by this closed circle. We adopted the logo here, but we understood it from the beginning as very restrictive and didn't think it was such a nice idea to be in a circle fenced in, ummauert, by surrounding houses. And when I dug a bit deeper and in follow-up projects, I found out that the solidarity, the idea of solidarity, is not restricted by the municipal boundaries of the city. Yes, the municipality has only control over its like within its city boundaries, but in other areas, be it other actors don't stick to this boundary. And the idea of solidarity city, I think, is much wider, leapfrogs over these boundaries. And there are also very interesting ways, non-territorial ways, where even administrations operate. City networks, for example. There are so many networks, overlapping networks, Eurocities, cities of refuge, Ciudades Solidarias in Latin America, Seebrücke, you name it. They are connecting different cities with each other. So it's not a territorial kind of model of solidarity. And then, so we were able to identify some of these characteristics of solidarity city, and we looked in other parts of the world, and Helen also mentioned this Solar City project, this partnership project. IMIS is also a partner and a participant in this. If you're really interested, you can scan the code and it takes you to our tree. And in the context of this project, we're looking in different parts of the world. So we have partner institutions and researchers and practitioners in North America, South America, Africa, and Europe in particular, IMIS. And we're finding that these kind of cities appear in different parts of the world, in different contexts, of course. They don't look exactly the same, but the principal ideas are there. In the US, of course, I just mentioned sanctuary cities. There's a whole history that's well documented, starting with the city of Berkeley, offering sanctuary to soldiers resisting the Vietnam War. So it had nothing to do initially with migration, but then in the 80s, San Francisco began prohibiting the use of municipal resources to assist federal immigration enforcement authorities. And then it was about refugees, protecting refugees, but then it became more about protecting people within cities that didn't have status. This idea of sanctuary cities then leapfrogged to Canada, and then Toronto became the first sanctuary city in Canada, followed over the years by other municipalities and cities. And we find similar kind of approaches in continental Europe. Spain, Germany, Berlin has committed to especially with the previous government, local government, to being a sanctuary city. I did research in Freiburg. I just showed the image. I also understand that activists in Osnabrück have been quite active with Seebrücke and so forth. In Latin America, there's also something called Ciudades Solidarias. It looks a bit different because it's mainly organized by international organizations, supranational organizations such as UNHCR. In Africa, we have a very different situation. We have often weak Westphalian states, and we also often have weak municipalities, but yet we find these solidarity structures in civil society, in other places. A colleague of ours in the project, Teresa Kassa, calls Nairobi Africa's sanctuary city and wrote a whole book about this. In Asia, we find some of these structures. Antje Misbach and her colleagues called a city in Indonesia a sanctuary city. There's research on Malaysia and Turkey, Istanbul, and so forth. So around the world, we find these maybe not exactly solidarity city in the way that it's conceived in North America and Europe, but we find something similar. We find cities with, in the words of Sarah Schillinger, with a local solidarity infrastructure. And this infrastructure can look differently in different places depending on their geopolitical factors, national systems, the role of cities in national politics, and so forth. But this solidarity infrastructure often exists to challenge, or does challenge, the Westphalian approach towards migration control. And I just want to, so I think the underlying principle of solidarity city and solidarity, an urban solidarity network, is something very different from the Westphalian idea of controlling, governing migration based on sovereignty, insisting on sovereignty. The urban approach is a very different approach. So I just want to wrap up because I think we also want to have some time for discussion. I would really like to hear what you think about this and if you have any questions. So what I tried to do is, first I offered a fundamental critique of the Westphalian system, its control of human mobility, and the way that the system produces migration, to connect to your new initiative here in Osnabrück. And then I proposed that solidarity and sanctuary cities and solidarity cities present a different way of thinking about human migration. But I think also in reality, we have to acknowledge that the nation state is not going to go away soon, and both of these systems are coexisting. And I'm not suggesting that the solidarity infrastructure is utopian in any way, because it actually exists. We can empirically observe that this exists. So in reality, the two coexist, and in many ways they need to work together. And we do see this at, in some cases, when during the Trump administration in the US, we could see the open conflict between the mayor of New York and Trump and how they were at each other. But in most cases, they are actually they're collaborating with each other, or in some way play politics with each other. And just a final point is that challenges again this Cartesian kind of territorial logic of the nation state, is that the solidarity has very interesting geographies, especially urban solidarity is simultaneously local, and it's anchored in local politics, a local urban infrastructure of solidarity. At the same time, it's translocal and transnational in scope, connecting different places, having these urban networks. And I think that opens very interesting possibilities and perhaps even politically new subjectivities and politics in the way that we know from this kind of Hegelian Marxian kind of solidarity. And then, of course, in an urban context, I think we also need to see that migrants are not construed as outsiders, but that they're actually migrants and refugees, however you construct them and define them, are actually constitutive of this very society. So I'll leave it here. I hope I'm sure you have questions, but I also hope for some really interesting discussion.